Nothing.
No. Um, so I'll just get started. I mean, maybe Marco will come and maybe he won't. Um,
And Lucy also reached out, mentioned she might be able to attend one of the coming
okay,
sessions.
okay. So hang on, I need to find what I was looking for here.
I think these are the best chapters, actually.
These are amazing chapters and so relevant to current issues that we're dealing with, right? So, okay, here's where I wanted. So, I prepared a short introduction. Not there, okay. So I have 5 points roughly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Batesonian trick. I'm going to use part of Bateson to talk about all of Bateson, and I'm going to do it using the quotation from Blake that Bateson picked out, because I think it's interesting anyway, and also because I'm actually studying Blake right now for another project. So all things Blake for me are perfect. But so in the Metalogue, he quotes from Blake's text about Europe, and I thought I would read it aloud. So, thought changed the infinite to a serpent, that which pitieth to a devouring flame, and man fled from its face and hid in forests of night. Then all the eternal forests were divided into earths rolling in circles of space, that like an ocean rushed and overwhelmed all except this finite wall of flesh. Then was the serpent temple formed, image of infinite shut up in finite revolutions, and man became an angel, heaven a mighty circle turning, God a tyrant round. So it's this lovely image about, well, it could be about lots of things, but it's in the context of the discussion this morning, it's about how we humans tend to box away part of our infinities into these little boxes. And it gets us into all kinds of trouble, which Blake is alluding to here, right? So, so in the text that we have to read, in both texts actually, they are explorations of this idea that consciousness is structured around this idea or approach to purpose. Everything is done as a purpose. And I think it's actually Nora that says, or maybe it's Blake, and maybe it's Bateson, Gregory, who says that even being helpful is purpose driven. So because of course, many people in the environmental movement are saying, well, we need to be helpful towards the planet. But of course, being helpful towards the planet is actually reinforcing the purpose orientation, which has gotten into trouble in the first place. So there's a kind of a paradox built into this problem, which the two texts are struggling with. The Metalogue is very interesting too, because it's a dialogue between Gregory and his daughter, implicitly Mary Catherine Bateson. But in a way, I found that the text by Gregory Bateson that we had to read for this morning, and the text by Nora Bateson that we had to read for this morning, are almost like a meta-dialogue between a meta-father and a meta-daughter. Because in a way, Gregory Bateson in his text, he's asking a kind of question. He's sort of exploring all this stuff, and he's saying, can one try to understand complexity so as to effect necessary change? That's the kind of question that he's asking. And hi, Lucy. Oh, I'm in the middle of my introduction and you've just missed the opening bit, but which I could reread actually, maybe at the end. But so I was just talking about these, the text between Gregory Bateson and the text between from Nora Bateson. They're a kind of a meta dialogue between a meta father and a meta daughter about the questions that Bateson is asking. So his question is, can one understand complexities so one can effect necessary change? Which is, you can see he's struggling with this issue because he's laying out the problem that we have in our culture between systems complexity thinking and purpose oriented thinking. And he's doing that because he sees there are massive problems setting themselves up because we're all focused on purpose rather than systems complexity. But he's laying this out because he's thinking, well, we need to change this. We need to do something. But of course, we need to change this is a purpose-driven argument. And so he's stuck in his own paradox. And Nora Bateson's answer is different. She says, well, you can't do it that way. You've got to play with the edges. And play with the edges is, of course, something that is in Gregory Bateson's work. But it's something that it's part of the emerging message, I think, from Greg. And Nora picks up on this point and says, it's not about purpose, it's about play. And the only way we're going to get out of the problem that we're in is if we learn to abandon a purpose-driven approach and look at this more general, playful, non-objective, to pick up on some of the issues that are in the dialogue with the daughter in What is Instinct. Not objective, not piecemeal, right? So play is not piecemeal in its organization. So anyway, so I think there's something very interesting going on there in the dialogue between the two. It reminds me of, so when I was thinking about, in a way, my own writing efforts with my cycle of science fiction books, which is this huge cycle of books, is a kind of effort to address issues that are present in our current world without focusing on purpose, focusing on the complexity of the problem. So it's like a novel cycle, but it tries to do things in a complex systems way rather than in a purposeful way, which reminded me again of Frank Herbert's Dune, which also struggles with presenting things in a complex system way. And the sort of the knot inside Herbert's book is this idea of terrible purpose, which is what his protagonist is struggling with. But in a way, it's not just terrible purpose, but it's actually purpose that he's struggling with. Anyway, so kind of a mise en abîme, what's that? A recursive embedding of these different ideas inside each other. Bateson also talks about the problem of, so I use the term legal persons. It's not quite what the terminology that he uses, but he means the same thing. It's the institutions and organizations that have been set up in our society that operate on their own mandate in a self-sustaining way, but which do not incorporate the values that human beings necessarily have in their own discussions. And so we have, I think in his three, we have the individual in their own psychology. We have the society, and then we have the ecology, which are the three units that he examines. But the problem is that the society incorporates these completely amoral elements, which are institutions, and any structure that has, and these structures will maintain the old system, even if the rest of us want to change it. So we're again, the paradox around change is rendered more difficult by the presence of these extra pieces, which is, I think, is also part of the whole thing. So I'm not going to go on anymore. It's sort of roughly my introduction. Maybe I'll go back, since Lucy missed it, and reread the Blake quotation from the What is an Instinct? Thought changed the infinite to a serpent, that which pitieth to a devouring flame, and man fled from its face and hid in forests of night. Then all the eternal forests were divided into earths rolling in circles of space, that like an ocean rushed and overwhelmed all except this finite wall of flesh. Then was the serpent temple formed, image of infinite shut up in finite revolutions, and man became an angel, heaven a mighty circle turning, God a tyrant crowned. So I'll stop there.
I was taken very much in the meta dialogue of how many times, which goes to the point of his, that you pointed out, Geoffrey, of him exploring and being how many times he said "I don't know" to his daughter in that dialogue, and so that that indicated to me, I really appreciated his way of working with her, of really saying "I don't know," you know, and then going on. And it made it feel like a really intimate exploration of the ideas that they were talking about in terms of instinct and what was going on. Everything that I read Nora, and I agree with you that I read Nora. It probably happened. I read Nora first, and then I read him, and I'm going, this got to be Nora's voice. I didn't, but I know that it was Catherine, probably, more than likely. And I also, when I read about the purpose versus nature, it's reminded me of how close him and, at one time, him and Alan Watts were very close in terms of this notion of purpose and Zen. Because Zen has a koan-like of, their koans is to really challenge the linear, purposeful thinking, rut kind of thinking, and so it reminded me of a quote that Alan Watts in a dialogue with Bateson had about purpose, and how Zen tries to help us really sit with that paradox.
Well, I'll jump in. I don't know exactly where I'm going with all this, but I do have a purpose. Okay, I want to make sense of this text and other texts that I've been reading, and meaning making and sense making are deeply related, and I'm all for going into conscious purpose and having question marks about it. But I'm very reluctant to throw it out and replace it with something else called play. Because for me, as an actor, you know, you have a text. The actor has to perform and keep an audience interested. Otherwise, they could just stay home and read the play if they wanted to. But to go to a play, great plays, people go to them over and over and over again, many different productions of them. And I think there's a reason for that, that actors go into characters and look for what they call a through line, something that holds all these different states together over the course of the 2 hours or 3 hours that the play is happening in public time. So yes, it's play, and there's goals, mini goals. I mean, little micro perceptual kind of spaces from which larger social emotions that are more explicit emerge. And I think that macro perceptual level is underneath most people's radar. Most people have called it the unconscious. But I think it's more than that. I think it's currently a lot of people are talking about the cognitive, the non-conscious. It won't ever be conscious, but it has enormous impacts on us. But I think that both the authors, Nora and Gregory, I think she's very hopeful that we can expand and increase our capacities for tuning in. This is very musical. These affective zones, which are not the same thing as emotions, emotions are sort of social understandings about what's appropriate and what's polite and what is rude. Those kinds of emotions, we all know which are appropriate and which are not in certain contexts. But affects don't have a name. They're much less about the emotional expression as it is about mood and shifts in mood. And moods can last for a very long time. And actually, that's what I think happens after the play is over or after the concert is over. There's a mood that the audience or the reader or whoever who's, you know, part of this adventure, they take with them, and it can last for years. And I think that's why we go to theater over and over again, even the plays we know really well, or watch the same movie over and over again, or like to go back and reread that poem, even a poem we've memorized. You know, we certain lines come back to us, and we just go over them and over them and over them. And I think it's not because there's something we don't understand. It's just something that we will never understand. That I think all these language games or gestures that we make or the songs that we sing are all sort of pointing to this. And so I have a real problem with her dismissal of democracy. It's not working. And I'm saying I think capitalism isn't working. And I don't think we've given democracy a chance. So I'm very reluctant to, let's just move on. To what are we going to move on? So I grant you that democracy is in crisis because of capitalism and neoliberalism and the devastating effects on the ecology of money when it is unleashed as it has been by, you know, derivatives. This is a new history of money, what's happening now. It isn't just forecasting or predicting, it's locking the future into a kind of grid. And this, I believe, is the search for the algorithm is the real conflict zone for a lot of us, because algorithms are, the abiotic and the biotic have to be differentiated. And I think it's all in a mess right now. We're all in quite a muddle as we start to, but I think the joy of reading William Blake, as you just did, and listening to the history of that first essay, I think he's talking to a group of people. He's talking about Lebanon, I think it's kind of the Palestine and in Greece, and looking at those old conflicts that just repeat themselves over and over and over through many different generations, and how we need to get to another level so we can sort of untangle this paradox. I think that's really interesting. And he also talks about the Gnostics, and those are the ones I think William Blake is a Gnostic voice when he recognizes that the monotheistic God, Yahweh, Jehovah, is the demiurge, the tyrant, and that most religions, which may start out of the, creating bonds with others and with nature, I think there's it gets these dominant forces that want to freeze, I think are very strong. But I think these are the kind of challenges that I have as I read this, because I feel like I'm a Gnostic. I think I really recognize when I read about the Gnostics and those cults that ended up in the desert, and they were experimenting with different meditation techniques, and they were speaking in tongues, and they were getting visions. I think they were very, they did not want to serve the powers that be, and those religious those kind of religions that wanted to hold that kind of top-down relationship. They resisted with their imaginations. That's all they had, was their imaginations and the power of language. So I think those Gnostic Gospels that were discovered in those jars in the desert in Egypt, I think really shook people up to realize, how volatile and fluid and dynamic the early Christian era was. And I think we're going through something very similar, as the powers that be are starting to crack open. And I think the many Gnostic voices are coming forward now. And I think that both of them follow this, I think the theme of art and music and poetry is going to save us. But I'm just very reluctant we don't have an alternative to capitalism, but that doesn't mean capitalism is working. And I think that's where the left, if there is such a thing left, as the left, there's so much squabbling going on. I think we may not have alternative, and I consider myself very far left. We may not have an alternative to capitalism, but I think we need to keep front and center in our attentions how fragile the ecology is. And I think these are the voices of Gregory and Nora. I think they're sounding this alarm, even though they don't have a clear alternative narrative to direct our attentions to. So anyway, I'm just sharing my own frustration here, because this is very difficult. But I think these last two chapters in the Gregory are his best writing for me. I think they sort of capsulize everything that's gone before. So thank you.
Hi. Thanks for having me back. I'm sorry for my extended absence. I've been very busy, which I won't go into. So yeah, I've caught up on a little bit of the last few weeks, but not fully by any means at all. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit on what John's just said. in just to say that, I mean, maybe this is what you're directly referring to, I'm not sure, but the most recent, I think, N. Catherine Hale's book called the Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, is has lots of parallels with it's like a development, I guess, of a lot of Gregory Bateson's thinking on this. And so if you haven't, I haven't read it. I've literally bought it last week, completely unrelated to this. But so in this book, she's thinking about all these things that Gregory Bateson is talking about in terms of consciousness and the kind of thinking about the non-conscious, but she uses it as a way of considering technology as well. So thinking about how technological systems might be considered to have cognition in some way. So, but it's kind of extrapolated from the idea that that plants and single cell organisms or whatever have a level of cognition, but not consciousness. But this kind of thinking about this kind of murky ground in between, and what sort of constitutes consciousness. So, but she calls all of these things cognitive assemblages, I think. So it's just kind of an expanded way of thinking about different forms of life, which is what I was thinking about when I was reading this, the first of the two Gregory Bateson chapters. So I've summarised that really badly. Obviously, I haven't read it yet, so it's a bit difficult. But I saw her speak a few weeks ago in London in relation to the Kathy Acker exhibition that's currently on at the ICA, where she was talking about the cognitive non-conscious in relation to Kathy Acker's bodybuilding work her training as a bodybuilder. Sorry, that's a bit of random throwing that in, but I hope that's useful.
Thank you, Lucy, and welcome back. And that is what I was referring to. I was referring to her book, which I read a while ago and probably could reread, because it's not an easy read. But I do think there's a family resemblance between what she's talking about. What we have cognitive access to, we're learning more and more. It's very little. But we can do so much more than just access cognition. And I think that the cognition at its best is riding upon waves of somatic intelligences, which are in relationship, and at our best, we are in rapport with what used to be called the environment. I think a lot of his vocabulary is sort of being deconstructed, because a lot of people have big question marks about what the environment, which you want to add to the organism, could possibly be. So I think these are the challenges, because the boundary is so fluid and so permeable and so open. Yet there is a boundary. It's not arbitrary what goes in and what goes out of a cell, or how tissues and organs and organisms are arranged. But I think it's that I think there's that controversy about closure and openness, and what's open and what's closed, and the difference between information and biological. And obviously, it's not something that it's a little of both and a little of neither. There is something in between that we don't have direct access to, but that we can intuit, because we're just observers and we're participants. And I think as we get more and more mature, we start to realize how much our observations change what's going on. And I think this is where those previous experiments in quantum mechanics are so captivating and have caught our imaginations about the particle and the wave, and how actually the way we observe has an influence upon that, and that we may be walking waveforms, and through our observation and participation with each other, we are shaping events in ways that are very, very bizarre and seem to be, I believe there is a direction. The direction is novelty. Innovation may be a buzzword that the neo-liberals use. I think that's a real distortion, though, of this kind of creativity, because it's definitely not about maximizing profits for a few. There's much more going on than that. And if you try to fight that, I think, or try to use your derivatives to lock in the prize for the future, I think you're just going to be, you could expect a backlash. Thanks for bringing that up.
So I wanted to come back to this issue of purpose, because when I listen to you, Johnny, there's a part of me that says, oh yeah, that's what I meant. I didn't mean to say throw out purpose and replace it with play. But then there's another part of me that says, yes, but purpose, it's in everything that we do, and it's all tangled into the system. But it is what gets us into trouble. And so I'm kind of on both sides of the fence on this one. I kind of, yeah, we're talking about paradox and purpose and play, and these different, the non-conscious and the conscious are all present and all have to be dealt with together. I definitely agree with that. However, I do think that there is an issue around purpose that, and Nora is struggling with it. I mean, in her way as well, you know. So, and so I'm not sure what the answer to that is. It's maybe more a question than an answer. And all of these different writers are struggling with it in different ways. I mean, the thing about capitalism, I mean, I agree with you. And yet I think that many of the problems that we have in the world are not so much about capitalism per se, but also about their consequences of a focus of attention on purpose-driven, you know. So I mean, the sort of backlash against immigrants that we're getting worldwide now through all the different elections that are currently in play. So you can come up with arguments related to capitalism about that. I think part of what's going on is people are focused on their immediate, you know, and fears, and all of this stuff is coming back through the system, and that has to do with not being attentive to the systems issues, the complexity of the world and the psychologies that we all carry with us, you know. And so some of this backlash that we're getting has to do with the unmanaged shadow inside all of us that is coming out in all of these different, often quite terrifying ways. And it's not only economically driven, and so it's a complex piece anyway. And Lucy, your point about technology, that's another thing that Gregory talks about in his text. He says that these things were already present in human beings and have been for a long time, but it's a technology that's exacerbated them into a huge issue in terms of exaggerating their effects, amplifying their effects. And now we're into all of these exponential effects that are coming from pushing and accelerating these processes to the point where where even small slippages become huge effects. So, yeah. Sorry, not quite a coherent response, but
We forgive you. Well, I want to become an ontologist of vibrational force. That's my desired outcome here. It's not a modest outcome, and it may not be something I get from this exchange. It may be happening tomorrow, the next day, or next year, or the next lifetime. But I think a desired outcome is very different from a proposed solution. And I feel this is going to be increasingly a skill that people are going to have to acquire, because it doesn't come naturally to us to explore the structure of our desire, or to state it explicitly what we want. We usually tend to distort our desires and what we want by trying to make it fit a current paradigm. And if you've had enough weird episodes, I suspect that many of us have, we start to realize this paradigm which we've been given, the theory of mind, which we've inherited from our culture, isn't true. It's just not true. I've had too many experiences that freaked me out, and they freaked me out because not because sometimes they were so subtle and so odd that they were almost like, I almost didn't notice them. But when I start paying attention to those synchronistic events, I'm sure we've all had, or those meaningful coincidences, or those that acausal connecting principle that Jung called it, between dream, fantasy, vision, and something that happens in our social worlds. I think the inside and the outside are called dramatically into question during these events. So I think we're in this sort of hypnotic, very negative trance that we're all separate, and all have to fight over limited resources, and the winner takes all. I think that kind of aesthetic is obviously will create us. Our species will be doomed very quickly by maintaining that. And I think the modern is over. I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to that, but some people are still grieving for it and have not gone through that grief process, and they're still clinging tenaciously to their the investment that they've made in this system that is dying. I think we're all at different levels of grief. Some people are celebrating that this is over. But anyway, I'm just ranting a little bit here, and I probably had a little too much coffee. But I think there's and I'm also still responding to a conversation that I had with some of our community here last night, talking about creative writing. And I think there's relationships between conversation we're having here and the conversation that we had there. And I'm sure, but I do want to make a plea actually for, if not purpose, but for desire. That your desires, it doesn't mean that if you know what you desire, you're going to get it. But if you don't know what you desire and what you want, what you do get is going to be a mess. And it has a lot to do with, well, what were you paying attention to? And what were you not paying attention to? And how were you sharing attention with others? And I believe this is where the arts are so foundational for any kind of civilization, because that's where we learn very early how to share attention. And those performance spaces, creating art, going to galleries and museums and listening to music, dance. I mean, this is where we learn how to coordinate our rhythms with one another. And this is what sustains our civilization, or what, or could move us towards a civilization. Anyway, I'm sure all of you guys know all this already, but I just wanted to make a plea for, let's really cultivate that desired outcome. Even though I may not know how to get it, that I want it and that I've shared it publicly with others is important. and you share your desired outcomes with me. And then out of that, I believe, can come something more coherent than laissez-faire capitalism. And I believe that Nora and Gregory both want this, desire this as well. I believe they also intuit that there's a greater coherence that our focused, our attention can bring to all of the systems that we interact with.
So two things that have been stimulated in me by reading and listening to this conversation is, for me, contrasting a purpose that is based in common sense, which to me, that means what I've been told or dictated to how to make sense of the world, which to a certain degree, we have to accept that that's part of how we even come to understand making sense in a way. If I didn't have others helping me as a young child make sense of the world, I would be in fucking trouble. But at a certain point, making sense challenges common sense, which common sense is tied to purpose or intent because it can narrow, it can narrow into a binary in such a way that we're shut off. We're not open like we were, which I think we need to kind of get back in touch with, of the trust of a child, but with a mature adult, as John and I have talked, heart, and cultivate what's been said here from everybody else. But you know, Nora activated the metaphor of the martial artist in dealing with chaos. And I was I'm going, yay! Because she made a point of, if we are trying to over control the chaos, we get caught in it, rather than maybe step back like a martial artist and not necessarily not engage, but step back, because some things, chaos, the part of chaos and what purpose or intent we bring in terms of relating to it is very, very, very important. Like a martial artist is, how much am I going to perpetuate the chaos, or how much am I going to just step back, work with it, and kind of just let it settle? And that I feel is what I go along with you, John, and even Geoffrey and Lucy, that is what art, in the broadest sense to me personally, is about. Is Gregory to me was perfectly clear of what we've lost touch with. Purposeful thinking is narrowing our ability to sense the whole system, whether we understand it or not, but we can sense it. You know, that analogy he did with boxes and climbing the tree, the myth he made, that has a place. Purposeful thinking, with a goal at mind, but sometimes we get so narrow that it is solution driven rather than creative, if I can put it that way.
Thank you, Michael. That was well said.
I like your idea about desire as opposed to purpose, Johnny, because in a way, that's how I do my 20-year plans that I've talked about at another time. What are my 20-year plans? They're a structured set of long-term goals, which I don't set out on purpose to achieve. I allow the field to come in and assist in achieving. And this is a very different way of putting into action something than a purpose-driven approach. It's not this very narrow approach. It's this approach that draws on the broader field in order to achieve goals. And so maybe that's a middle ground between purpose and the narrow focus of purpose and the systems thinking kind of thing that Gregory and Nora are talking about. So
I think there's a relationship between that 20-year plan based on your desire and opening up to the field to assist. And the martial artist that Michael mentioned, and I believe maybe Nora uses that as well. And what I was talking about, I want to become an ontologist of vibrational force. And I also want to add, I want to become an epistemologist. I think ontology and epistemology have been falsely separated and put in different heaps. And I think this is one of the desired outcomes of both Gregory and Nora, is to bring ontology and epistemology in relationship once again. And I do believe that based upon my experiences of group life, that we hold a shared desired outcome. We create through the field effect. There is a field that responds. When I was about 11 years old in the Deep South, there was no such thing as gay or queer. There were pathological terms like homosexual. It was really something to be ashamed of and to hide. And you were criminalized, or you were put into a prison or a jail, or you were given drugs, or you were turned into some sort of, I mean, it was just horrific. You were doomed to prostitution, drugs, and a life of misery. This was part of the whole consensus reality. And I remember saying, no, I'm going to do something different. Not because it's happened in my environment or anyone supporting it or someone's reinforcing it, because I don't know anyone else who feels this way. And I just remember that Stonewall riot that happened in 68 or 69 in the village. And I saw it on TV in my mother's kitchen. I was watching it and I just saw these like nerdy kids. Some of them were dressed in drag and they were arm in arm and they had a big banner. They were like, and they were, causing a riot that shut down the city for 3 days and forced the city to negotiate with them. And I just saw that and I said, I want to go there. That's where I want to live. And, people from all across the world and from all across America rushed to the West Village and the East Village where I live now. And we started something, but it isn't because we had a plan. We had a desire. It was very strong and very, I think it was very affectively driven. I mean, it was something that we just felt really, really deep, but we couldn't put it into words. But I think the effort to get together and to put it into words, a plan starts to emerge, but it's like, not exactly like, it's sort of like, oh, well, this event happens in a structured way, which creates the conditions for another event to happen, which is totally unstructured, but that benefits the desired outcome of this group. So that's my direct experience of the having a center, centering with others, an opening to a field has real life results. And what we pay attention to changes. So I think that collective unconscious starts to change as we start to pay more and more attention to it. So, and I'm sure all of you have also had these experiences, that when you have a strong desire and you articulate it and you are in rapport with others who have a similar desire, that things start to change. And I believe that this is what Bateson and Nora draw upon constantly in both of these texts, is this almost a magical capacity that humans have. But unfortunately, those who are in the minority, who are making gigantic profits by maintaining this very, very sterile, yes, purpose-driven rather than desire-driven. I think that is true. It is causing great havoc. But you know, what are we going to do about this? I think just by paying attention to how incredibly fragile it all is, I think can create a desire to protect and preserve that isn't just driven by some kind of status quo, but dealing with that chaos, being at the edge of chaos, and appreciating complexity prevents us from actually falling into chaos. I don't think we should want to go into chaos. I think we should be at the edge of it, and that's where we're most creative.
Well, and I also think that part of that fear of the edge of chaos, the way I will frame it, is out of how complexity is sensed. This is my coming through me, not coming through Bateson, but maybe it's influence. The unknowability of complexity when we're faced with it, what to do with it, you know, and that sets that counterpoint of chaos, and so we're put in this position, this co-intention of how to work with that tension of complexity and the chaotic feeling and the desire to have an effect on it or to change it and move it around. And I feel my journey has been to challenge how I've been taught to pay attention to that tension, because our attention has been conditioned, and this is part of the things that I feel Gregory and Nora in their use of language, and they're challenging I feel they're really challenging how I pay attention, and I'm forced to maybe question how I've been taught to pay attention. And neoliberalism, or all the way, because Gregory is really informed by family dynamics of how we've been taught to pay attention, and the art is the one thing that tells you, fuck it, decide how to pay attention for yourself. That is not to mean that you have to become egotistical or not want to share attention, but that is a possibility with some people. Let's get real. Some people go there, but to me, I think it's larger to think like Gregory and Nora, that we want to share a new kind of attention in dealing with the complexity and chaos we feel happening at this moment. This is how, to stay with the language, it has affected me without trying to make emotional narratives about it. Because art itself is centered around paying attention.
Yeah, so art are brought out both by Gregory and Nora, and it's also part of my efforts over the years to re-bridge the sciences and the arts. So
very good, yeah.
Because I felt that what is missing from science is the broader frame provided by the arts.
I agree, Geoffrey.
Which is grounded in the sort of spiritual integrity of human beings, and that is missing from the science. So sort of grappling with this issue is a way of trying to reintroduce and some of those sensitivities back into the sciences. And of course, I'm not alone in this. There is a movement now that is looking at this. There are journals now that look at art's integration into scientific research, and so again, it's another area. It's a field effect.
So maybe you're the person to ask to check something. Is science has always been the way I've digested it is about how something works. Is that
the way I tend to think of it is science in terms of the relationship, and it's part of the work that I'm doing, is science is interested in explanations that are based on regularities. Okay. Art is kind of, it's difficult to say it in a few words, even more for arts than it is for science. But in a sense, it's a focus in on the specific, which goes against the grain of what science tends to want.
Because it's more
abstract out.
Abstract out. I was thinking
art
general.
Wants to
I was thinking
drill in and give you a very specific focus, a very specific kind of experience, and the universal emanates out from that very specific experience. So there is a link back to the universal, but it's not by going through abstraction, it's by focusing in. And the problem of linking the arts and science, I mean, in terms of practice, is so there are practices that you can put into play practices where artists and scientists are both involved in some sort of practice, and then there's dialogue and discussion between the two, and this generates interesting work. But from a theoretical point of view, they're almost on opposite ends of the spectrum. It's very hard to sort of figure out an integrative theory. And so this is why we're focusing on this idea of singularity, because what the work I've been doing with my collaborators suggests is that one can come to some sort of framing understanding of singularity which is specific to the arts, if you like, in terms of what's going on, but a kind of a framing understanding of singularity which can speak to the sciences. And so there may be a way to bridge the two through an understanding of singularity. So
I remember you used the metaphor of toggling between, didn't you?
Maybe, yeah, I probably do that.
So is that part of is that part of a integrative framework, is to be able to toggle back and forth?
Well, because it's if to go back to Johnny's quantum comments, so field, wave, and particle. You know, I mean, this is built into, well, it's built into reality, and it's built into our understanding of reality, that reality has these two properties. And so, and they're both present, and they're entangled together in ways that are difficult to separate out. But for certain contexts, one can be looking at something which is rather more particle-like, and for other contexts, you can look at things that are rather more wave-like. And so you can think about toggling between those two perspectives, you know, but you can't always toggle. You can only toggle if there's enough distinction going on, there are things going on. But if they're so entangled that you can't separate them clearly one from the other, there's no toggling going on, right? So it depends on the circumstance.
Gotcha. Okay.
But that's very suggestive, I think, of I think it's sort of a truism that many were saying, that there's the macro and the micro, and the quantum mechanics applies to the micro, and it doesn't scale up.
It does, but it's difficult to scale up.
Exactly, but it does scale up.
It does scale up.
And that's what we're starting to realize, that whole idea that there's a separation between micro and macro has to be, that there's a meso area, and there's an interplay. So I believe we're starting to feel the effects now of that quantum starting to scale up in our technology. Quantum computers are on the way. They're just right around the corner. And I don't think and that will be taking this internet and ramping it up 100 times. I mean, it's going to be, the difference between TV and the internet is gigantic. I think that the difference between what we have now and what we're going to have when quantum computing is widely distributed potential, I think it's going to change dramatically what we're doing even now.
Quantum computing doesn't mean that quantum effects are more present in our daily lives, because quantum computing is a very specific way of doing things. I mean, I think it will have unexpected spin-offs from it, but I don't know that it's quite, you know, quantum everything. You know, it doesn't really work that way, right?
Right. I agree, and you would be I would defer to your expertise here because I'm not a physicist, but I've listened to a social theorist like Alexander Wendt is talking about quantum mind and sociology, and his discussion centers around the transition that's happening between a Newtonian worldview, which we are all hardwired, and a quantum worldview, which no one has taken seriously. Even those double-slit experiments, which were done 100 years ago, has stayed pretty much confined in the physics community. But most people just muddle on through the best way they can, not thinking. But we're starting to realize, according to like Alexander Wendt, that that our minds are entangled. That language users, that we share a language, our minds are entangled. And our bodies might appear to be separate in space, but our minds cannot be parsed that way. And I find that very compelling, because what would our social worlds be like if that was a widely shared understanding, rather than this idea that I'm separate over here and my mind is in my head, and I'm separate from you over there, and your mind is in your head. And we have this code that we send somehow through, you know, our voices to one another, or we may be reading something. That's a different kind of code. And she's saying it's not about cracking the code; it's about catching the rhythm.
Yeah,
I think
that was Nora.
Expressing there this quantum wave-like a balance between particle and wave, perhaps that's happening through our attention. Our shared attention. I think that this is moving towards that, what some are calling a second order cybernetics, and perhaps a third order. I think that first order cybernetics is what Bateson and Gregory was sort of deconstructing, and I think it has been thoroughly deconstructed by Nora. I think she's moved beyond that, and she's calling it semathesy. But I think this is all very amusing because we're just playing around with words. And we're having to create a new vocabulary. But I think this will have, because our words and because our minds are so deeply entangled, this will have tremendous effects at the social level. So anyway, that's my spiel. And I think there's plenty of stuff in this chapter that's sort of, I'll just read one paragraph from Practicality and Complexity. And that I think is sort of looking at second order, a transition from second order to a third order, from a participatory observer who is no longer separate from the system to something that I think may be called third order even. I cannot offer any such program. She's talking about people who demand that she be practical. She says, it would be hypocrisy for me to do so. My whole life is centered around advocating for the delicate interdependencies of life. As a result, my work is sometimes seen as ethereal. I love that word. My students are frustrated because the only given is change. Life is mutual learning. Life shifts. Systems are in flux, for better and for worse. The unspeakable beauty of these interdependencies exactly matches the horror. The beauty lies in the ever-forming symmetries and asymmetries that evolve into unimaginable grace, and the horror in the sense that there is so much uncertainty and so little control. So I think I think we're not going to go for something that's more stable and more, so we can just relax and hang out. I think we may be going to something that's maybe more beautiful and more horrible at the same time. So what is it, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night? what immortal hand or eye could frame this fearful symmetry. I think that symmetry and asymmetry, I think both Nora and Gregory love that. You know, I think they get it from William Blake, who I think was very Gnostic and very disruptive kind of guy in terms of the status quo, because his visions were so intense. If you've ever looked at his pictures, he's just. I saw it at the Met a number of years ago. There was a huge show on Blake, and I wasn't prepared. I walked in, thinking this will be fun, because I'd seen Blake books and illustrations, but I wasn't prepared to see 200 of them, you know. And I felt like I was on acid at the end of this. It was going right into the subtle realm. And then you saw the texts, these little bitty texts with these intricate designs and drawings that weaving in and out of these beautiful little, very simple little poems. And you do feel like you've entered the weave of a very weird kind of system. And I think the weird is something that we're also starting to appreciate as we're moving out of this 3D Newtonian world into something that's more quantum. I believe some of us are getting more comfortable and enjoying the weird rather than trying to suppress it.
Interesting. I read a piece, and I can't draw on it, but the conversation here has activated a vague memory. But one of the things it was trying to talk about of working with this notion of how this perception of separation, because one of the reasons, if I understand it right, is because part of separation is to objectify or see objects in space and ignore the field. And this person was talking about try seeing each person as a field and sensing their presence and letting and you really challenge or question how you're objectifying the person when you see their body. And it was I went and practiced it out in the street, and it was really interesting. It's not that I didn't see their bodies, but it added another dimension and challenge how I'm just looking at, especially bodies, as objects and not as individual fields within the larger fields. And it was a good experiment of really challenging the notion of separation, which is useful as a function to move in the world. That's good. But we take it for granted of how much we get addicted to it, I guess.
Something that, firstly, Johnny, there's a big William Blake show opening at Tate this autumn, which I'm really excited about. So thank you for your relaying your experience. It makes me look forward to it even more. But that aside, something you were saying, actually what you were both saying, Michael and Johnny, made me think of this podcast I was listening to the other day about about Ingo Swann, who was the most, well, I'm not quite sure how you describe what it is that he was, but was the main sort of proponent for remote viewing, and was a major actor in the kind of in the use of remote viewing for lots of different things. But he one of the things he did was he viewed the rings of Saturn, I think. I forget which exact phenomena it was, but he he described the qualities of the rings of Saturn, let's say, before technology was advanced enough to be able to see them through a telescope or a shuttle or whatever. So he kind of it was like a process of transporting his mind. I don't know how you describe it, but anyway, remote viewing is often described, I think I've said this before in one of these groups, as a way of gathering knowledge from a remote or distant location. And the process in the CIA training manual for the remote viewing program describes it as like receiving the signal line, as in like if everything in the universe is connected in some way, all you need to do is find the path or the line that connects them. So and in this thing I was listening to, it was an interview with someone who's been working in the Ingo Swann archive in Georgia, wherever it is, a university in Georgia somewhere. And they were talking about how Ingo Swann was, his telepathic abilities were so strong. And part of that is perhaps to do with his understanding of what telepathy is, and that it's not like transmitting something from your mind to another person who then has to receive it. It's like a communing, or like a coming together, or like an entanglement of everything, which includes minds. So and once you start to think of it like that, it becomes a lot more possible, and less to do with like me breaking out of my physical conscious being through these boundaries and then somehow meeting in your seemingly impermeable boundaries over there. It's like the entanglement of it makes it cognitively more possible. So which I think is really relevant to what we've been talking about and thinking about with these texts. I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that. It's a bit of a left field comment, sorry.
I just yesterday picked up The Future of the Body again. I browsed through it. It's 700 something pages. And this time I want to read it most of the way through. There's a lot of examples that I say, oh, well, I understand that. I don't need to read 3 or 4 pages. But yeah, that comes up as this remote viewing as one of the extra sensorial or extra perceptions that we as humans have access to if we're I think you said receiving the signal line aligned with a certain field. It's another infinite possibility that this Blake said the image of the infinite is shut up in finite revolutions. So yeah, this body is a finite revolution and cycles of life, death, and eating, defecating, getting rid of, and taking in, and all of these finite things that we experience. What Nora Bateson and Gregory Bateson, even William Bateson, and what they're all pointing to is becoming aware of what Blake is talking about, this infinite realm. And just Geoffrey, I always come back to what Geoffrey talks about, I forget her name right now, but that each individual has their own ontology. And to a certain extent, we each have our own field, as we've talked about, or Michael mentioned, and we mentioned attuning to not the body, but the field, the various circles that are looping around in our thought and experience from birth to the present moment of when you see that person, rather than saying man, woman, long hair, whatever it might be. But being attuned to that infinite, that sometimes I ask myself, like, which infinite? There's perhaps various infinites that we talk about, that, or we can only grasp a certain aspect of the infinite. So even the infinite is compartmentalized into the creative act of art, or quantum science is now advancing into infinite realms outside of standard physics. And yeah, I think I like the idea of unthought. So thought changed the infinite into what was the serpent, into these finite circles, and unthought perhaps can be the launching back out into the infinite, but from a serpent mind that is we are creatively here trying to access that from within.
I want to come back to the word play and the sense of play, and maybe how I feel Nora is trying to use it, is that play has a purpose, but the purpose cannot be dictated by purposeful thinking. I think it ties into both Gregory and Nora understanding that ecologically, the word play just represents that which appears not to have any order, but there is an order of unfolding. If we kind of meet the ecology environment with that intent and attention, then play is a way of, without having a fixed purpose, the playful mindset is a way to really tap back into the overall system that Gregory talks about, that we've lost touch because of how I think Blake is pointing to, in my way of feeling into his words, is how thought in human beings has been, some of it is just part of the unfolding. Thought has been given attention to in its most narrow purpose, so that human beings used it in a very tight-ass survival mode, rather than the original, or let me change the word of that, rather than really paying attention to the whole system and us being a part of it with full attention. I hope I said that right.
No, I think that was very nicely put, actually, Michael. Yeah.
Thank you, Geoffrey.
I wanted to respond also. Thank you all. This is very interesting. About Inigo Swan. I've been a fan of his for quite a while, and he has a lot of fascinating stories because he was such an extraordinary, he was a visual artist, but he was also such a powerful psychic. And what you were talking about, the CIA remote viewing program, and I would love to get a hold of one of their manuals, and rather than give it to a secret society funded by the Pentagon, let's put it in our elementary schools, so that these kids who are already working with the magical in ways that most adults no longer can. I think they would be by far the most powerful group on the planet would be the children. If we were able to, rather than corral their imaginations in these tight little focused disciplines and these separated little silos in the academy, we could then start paying attention in very different ways. And if this was cultivated within a generation or two, who knows what would happen next? If we were all weaned away from this Newtonian idea of this 3D grid of separation, and like you were describing, Lucy, how we have to break through all these barriers to go somewhere else to have access to this, and start to play around with the idea that I think we all are, that it's much more about vibration. And it's much more like a musical experience where you're in a concert hall and the music, you don't know exactly where the music is. Is it on the inside or the outside? Or if a parent or a mother is, when the voice that your mother used when she was proud of you, I'm sure you can all remember that, and it's something in your vibratory system, you know, and it can still, it's still active. Even if you haven't heard your mother's voice in years, you can remember it. So I think those are the kind of, and the whole idea of the imagination, the theory of imagination is very underdeveloped, I think, in our current paradigm. And I believe that both Nora and Bateson and ourselves are wanting to maybe revise our thinking. And I definitely think there's something also to be said for, I think some of us have read Geoffrey Kripal's work. He wrote a book recently called The Flip, where he's looking at scientists who had flipped. You know, he uses that as a metaphor for this kind of, this transition out of the Newtonian into something that's more quantum. And some people, like I think Inigo Swan was an artist, and he had definitely flipped. But that the CIA was using these psychics to get information of the information, and they were using it in a very narrow way to defeat enemies. And there have been reports, David Morehouse, he has a book on remote viewing. I've not read it, but I know a little bit about his. There were many remote viewers who had enormous cognitive dissonance around this whole using this psychic material, this psychic information to disrupt other systems, or other political systems. When Saddam Hussein said that he was under psychic attack from the United States, there are the remote viewers who are saying that's true. They had an assignment to psychically kill Saddam Hussein. And I think we have to recognize that it may have been very good reasons for us to suppress these capacities, these imaginal capacities, because they're very powerful. And unless there is a corresponding maturity, a moral, ethical sensibility that's very refined, they can, I think, be used in disastrous ways that would make the atomic bomb look rather benevolent. But I think this is a real challenge for all of us to start. And I do agree, it's play, but that play is serious. When we're playing, we're doing something very serious. And it's not just, just ornamental, just icing on the cake. It's actually much more important, I think, than it is that we get credit for. And I think that's why the tragedy of arts programs being slashed in schools and pushing physics and mathematics, I think it's just really very, very stupid. Anyway, I also want to just add, I think there's an objective component to the imagination. I think this is what these remote viewing findings indicate, that the imagination is not just something subjective, but that there's an element of the imaginal which is objective. So I think that's extremely interesting, so that we can potentially create different kinds of technologies if we have enough scientists who have flipped, who have made this transition, they would, I think, be creating different kind of technologies than the technologies that the Pentagon is investing a whole lot of effort in. Thanks.
I do find Bateson's idea about what is objectivity very interesting in the dialogue. You know, we tend to think of objectivity as being some sort of looking at things in neutral or whatever way, but that's not what he says at all. He says it's looking at things individually with intensity, as opposed to, you know, so narrowing down and looking at one thing in intensity. I can't remember the exact quote. I'd have to go and dig it up from the dialogue, but it's a somewhat different take on. I mean, it's consistent with the other ideas of objective, but it's interesting the way he describes it. I haven't read Kripal. I was just the books are quite expensive, and my my book budget is. So I will look at it, but I must say that my upcoming retirement, I'm looking at it as a opportunity to do a lot of reading that I haven't had time to do. And I wanted to come back to Catherine Hales, because of course she's been writing about the links between science and the arts for a very long time. She was one of the very first people that I read in that area. I can't remember what the book was, but it was something she wrote way back. So she's been one of the writers who's really sensitive to the issue between making these two domains talk to each other, or looking at the links between them. I haven't read much of her recent work, but I've definitely put your recommendations onto my list, and I'll put them at the top of the pile. We've got another half hour to go. I'm wondering, Lucy, if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing. Just, I hate to put you on the spot, but.
Yes. How did that lecture series go? You said you were preparing for a lecture series.
Yeah, yeah, it was good, but it was just very intense. It was just for the undergrad program at Goldsmiths and in Fine Art and History of Art. So it was a more kind of theory-based teaching than I've done previously. Mostly I do studio practice. So it was a series of 5 lectures under within the module that's called Space and Time. And so I presented these 5 lectures, which I wrote very quickly on different aspects of my own research, which fitted within that module. So I did one on, I did them on, like, oh God, I can't remember now. Surrealism and dream, but also kind of magic. So through the sort of lens of magic, rather than just the usual story of surrealism and dream imagery. So talking about Austin Osman Spare and his use of magic within his practice, and how he fitted within the surrealists as a movement. I did one on Ethel Colquhoun and Standing Stones, and the Mark Fisher's idea of the eerie in relation to the British landscape and folk horror. I did other ones which I can't even remember. I did one on the development of the internet out of the Back to the Land movement and California kind of progress with sort of that developed the internet, sort of coming out of the idea of communes and networks and Buckminster Fuller and cybernetics and things like that, thinking about the Whole Earth catalogue. Yeah, lots of different things. So, which I can't remember now. But yeah, so I did 5 lectures, and then I was working on and installing an exhibition, which opened at the beginning of May, which was, I think, out of a project which I think I've mentioned before, which was this collaboration with the anthropology department at UCL. So it was a sort of 1.5 year long project where a bunch of anthropologists worked with a group of artists to think about the sort of diagrammatics of each of our practices. We ended up with an exhibition that was on for 4 weeks, I think, in May, so that was extremely time consuming as well. So I've just been kind of back to back intense work, which has been really good and really productive, but I'm now slightly less busy, but still quite.
So we're privileged to have you with us this morning.
Oh, I'm glad to be back. It's been really nice. It's been really nice revisiting Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson. I actually finally managed to watch the film as well, her Ecology of Mind film, which I actually wasn't a massive fan of. It was good to see it and to see lots of footage of them, but I found it not particularly revelatory. It felt like it was unfortunately, it was a bit repetitive. And maybe that's just because, we've read quite a lot of this book already, so it felt like a bit of a sort of surface engagement with his work. But nevertheless, it was good to see it. I'm glad I did. But yeah, it could have been more in depth, I think, which would have been interesting. I don't know what anyone else thought of that, but yeah, no, so it's good to be back.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. So I won't ask. I won't ask too much about it.
Yeah, the lecture series was good. It was a good way for me to kind of formalize my quite disparate ideas about things. And bring together my research and put it and think about it in a way that's legible to first-year undergraduate students. So that was kind of a bit of a challenge, but really interesting and rewarding. And we had some great seminars around the materials, and some really interesting conversations about dreams and magic and things like that, which I think was not quite what they were expecting, or what the students were expecting, I mean. But good. So yeah.
Can I ask you, Lucy,
Yeah.
you thought it may be a bit of a superficial treatment, the film? I haven't seen it, so...
but I thought everyone had, so...
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's a depth, I think you said, that it could have gone to, that it didn't. Is there anything else about that you could...
Well, I kind of see what you're saying, Lucy, about it. I mean, somehow it's a kind of introduction to, rather than a depth study per se or anything like that, right? So it's sort of a film for people who don't know much about him and his life, and introduce it. So for us who've been sort of diving deep into the work, it doesn't really give us a lot of that. Although I think there are insights that he shares, because it's wonderful to see him talk live. And I think there are insights that he shares that I found relevant and useful to my thinking about it. So
yeah, I think it was it's possibly something just to do with the structuring of the editing, or maybe it just needed to be shorter. I just felt like Nora's presentation of Gregory's work was kind of, I felt like she was saying the same thing many times, but with slightly different words, which I think does his work a bit of a disservice, because, you know, she was essentially, particularly in the first half, I think, was talking about the, you know, the sort of shifting of our understanding of reality through Gregory's work as being, you know, focused from the objects onto the patterns that connect. And it was sort of saying that in lots of different ways, without actually sort of bringing more without actually adding more meaning to it, which is just a bit of a shame, I thought, that's all, because it's, you know, it's a privilege to be able to hear one of his daughters talk so candidly, you know, about her relationship with him and his work, but it didn't go there in the way that I wanted it to.
Wasn't that one of her early into filmmaking projects? Could that possibly be a reason? Because I know that when I read about it and seen it, it kind of was saying that, you know, I felt that it was one of her first attempts to enter that medium. So that I'm just thinking that may be part of the reason that came through.
Yeah, that might well be the case. I don't know.
Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
I'm just wondering what wants to happen. What happens next after Gregory, after Nora, after Indigo Swan?
You go out and play. You go out and play.
For us, what do we do? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think we're at that. I think those of us who've been studying this way of thinking for a while are ready to go to the next level. And I also believe many of us may have had glimpses into something, you know, beyond the consensus reality in, you know, various altered states of consciousness or trance work or arts or whatever, or just daily life. But I think there's a question of translation. It's becoming really, I'm very aware of. You can't have transformation without adequate translation. And I feel like a lot of people are at the cusp of moving, of making, we're all transitional beings, and we're making this transition, I think, together. We can't leave anyone out. I think that's what the quantum is teaching us, is that you think you can privilege a group at the expense of another group. That's not going to work. And so I think we have to develop those skills of adequate translation. So once you have the eureka or the breakthrough or the cosmic download, you're going to have to translate it into something that's understandable to others. And that means sometimes you have to tone it down, you know, and you have to sort of go back to where you were before all of this happened, before these insights and understandings of this ecology of mind. You have to sort of, okay, well, how could I serve others who are heavily invested in this paradigm which is dying very quickly, and who are, you know, and I don't think any of us are know how to pull this off yet. But I think just a little that our experiments, our social experiments, our an experimental attitude in general, that is safe to fail. So we shouldn't create experiments that are unsafe to fail. I think this would get more people oriented to, you know, this re-education program that's well underway. And I do see lots of signs of really interesting work is being done, and people are sharing and creating knowledge with one another. I think we're doing that right now in these calls. And we may be moving rapidly towards what some are talking about as a post-money world, where we can, our knowledge is not going to be predicated on profits for a few. And I think this would be a huge liberational, I don't know what the word is, liberatory potential that could be unleashed. That's on my optimistic days. I sort of sense this. But I think that's why it's so important for us to use this technology in different ways than those who, you know, made this available to the public to sell their products and to, you know, create these hypnotic effects that create addiction rather than liberation. And I think that's how we're sort of having to figure this out on our own, and you know, create these little. They may seem isolated because so few people seem to be working at this post-money level. But I think just imagining what that would be like, sort of a kind of utopian fantasy about, oh, wouldn't it be great? You know, we were all just going with the flow, and we had released ourselves from these restrictions, and we had freedom, but not without constraints. We would have a different relationship to the constraints, and we would be working with a different set of constraints. And I think that's what I think Nora and their legacy, I think, would be. Many of us could go back, and I read this book 20 odd years ago. Now I'm rereading it, and I still struggle with it. But I think these last chapters are some of the best. And I think that if we could, you know, just make this part of the curriculum rather than something that's marginalized, it would be a great step forward. So anyway, thank you.
So actually, while I was a few minutes ago, I made a note to myself about the possibility of writing a text about a little bit like what Michael was talking about, exercises that one could do that would install this way of thinking about the world and that one can play with. And then, so I wrote down a few notes about this, and I thought, oh, well, maybe we could make it a group activity to develop this text, because I'm sure you guys have other ideas than I do about how these exercises could be done. So here's a little project we could run in parallel to the readings of the last group of texts to come up with some ideas, each of us, about exercises that could be done. Like you know, the 20-year plans that I mentioned is an example of one kind of exercise. The moving through space and thinking about each person as a set of overlapping fields, about the interactions between people as overlapping fields. But maybe there's something more tangible than just you know, perspective taking as per se, but maybe there's something that can actually generate something a little bit more substantial and more long term. So as an idea.
You know, you must have been in my head, Geoffrey, because everything you said is what I want to add too, is that I do feel that one of the exercises is the bringing the theory of meta awareness and making it, the practice is making it an action. And instead of perspective taking, I do these micro exercises of paying attention to how well I'm listening to the other in my translating, hearing how they're using their language, like I've been doing on this and out in the world. And when there's a point that when it feels at your best, we need to give attention to that and not just jump past it. We tend to jump past when there's these good moments, and just, there's this knee jerk to get through them or marginalize them. I think I love the word relish these experiences, the practice of relishing of a good experience of vibing. Relish it, like listening to relishing it. It helps build and make it tangible. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I noticed you picked up on Johnny's when you're acting at your best, which is the, I think it's the clean language, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and I like that language because, for most of my life, there was no language about mutual learning of somebody help me. Sometimes, when you're young or in different places, that's why I like the martial artists. The teacher is there to help you recognize this is your best. There is a mutual learning. You're doing it, and give it a little bit of relishment, not greedy, but relish. Oh, this is good. Now I know what it feels like to be at my best, and not just kind of smooth it over or not have any experience of being at your best. I think my biggest problem is, until recently, I had very few experiences of being at my best. I always question when I was anyway. Oh, that's not real. I'm not at my best. If that makes sense.
So I've called these experiments in quantum being and becoming.
Awesome. I love that.
Well, I feel I practice a lot of clean language with a lot of you guys in groups and as individuals. We just did something very recently, Michael and I, on death. And I think we drew upon some of that in our discussion last night with the creative writing group. So I think there are a lot of small experiments that we're doing with quantum poetics and clean language, and many of us have studied Jinlin and focusing, and there are many in there, and there's the martial arts, and there's music, and all of these poetry, all these different practices. I think are these are creating our attention, our meta attention, and sharing attention, and doing it with this technology. It's very, very interesting, and it's difficult. It's difficult for me because my formative years were not with this kind of technology, like we have now. But I think of peak experiences when you are at your best at this particular activity, whatever that is. That's like what? When you're writing at your best, that's like what? When you're reading at your best, that's like what? When you're communicating at your best, that's like what? It's an invitation to go into metaphor, but even more importantly than that, it's an invitation to experience yourself from a peak experience rather than from a feeling of deficiency and inadequacy or a critical thinking, which is so the tendency towards taking things apart. So I think that's one of the strategies that I think have invited others to participate with me in, and I think that's paying off. I think it's a good thing to invest in, is sharing our peak experiences, because when I see another person describing themselves at their best with a metaphor, that becomes part of our public discourse. And then I believe those overlaps between our different metaphors really starts to become a very, very powerful resource that we share, so that we're not just sucked into this competition 3D grid. And so I'm just going to share one from a long time ago. I had a terrible tragedy a friend that I dearly loved was hit by a car. He was hit by a truck, actually. It was an illegally parked postal truck, blocked his view. He was on a bike, so he couldn't see the Mack truck coming, and the light was broken, so that there was no red light. There was only green and yellow. So all those synchronistic events, those weird kind of serendipities, he braked too fast on a bike he wasn't used to. He flew over the handlebars and the truck killed him instantly. So I had a premonition of this before it happened. A few days before this happened, I described a scene, almost verbatim what did happen, and then very grief-stricken, because, you know, these precognitive kind of events can scare the hell out of you, especially if a tragedy, because you wonder, what could I have done to stop this? But I had a powerful feeling. I had a dream sequence, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was in that sort of hybrid, kind of lucid, not asleep, not awake kind of space. Not totally matter, not totally spirit, not totally, it was sort of in between. But I saw this golden light, and I could see him, and I knew it was Charles, and he said, I asked him, why are you coming back? And he said, I am from the golden light to tell you your grief is holding me back. And then the golden light just sort of shrank, and I was there in my dark room with this strong, very strong sensation. And I'm not saying my grief went away, but I had a different relationship to the grief. And now, 40 years later, I still recognize that a lot of things that I wanted to have happen are not going to happen because of this death. But I can share that. I'm just starting this practice of, well, what would happen if rather than treating, if I walked into the street and I live in Manhattan, it's a lot of people I can practice with. What if this person was from the golden light? And what if they had a message for me? I don't think my boundaries are good enough for this, because I tend to get very expanded really quick. But I think it's a form of prayer in a way. And it's certainly an as-if construct. I could just use my imagination. And I don't think it's an experiment that is going to hurt anybody. Because I know how to hold my energy in a way that, so that I'm not totally like a sponge just absorbing everything psychic that's coming at me. But I think it could be, just offer that, just as you were doing earlier, Michael, talking about when you pay attention to a person, there's still a body, but there's also a field that you're sensing, that they're connecting to. So that martial arts metaphor that you used earlier, I think is great. Or I think the idea of being an ontologist who's working with the vibration. Because I think ultimately our lives are art forms. We're making them up every day. I just think that's not widely distributed in our systems right now socially, but I think it could be. So every little thing you can think of from your dreams or your fantasies or your artwork, I think these practices will come forward, and we can play with them, and we can share them, and we may even report some results. Just an anthropologist going into a field, doing field work.
Well, and I'm glad you ended on that, because I consider my everyday life having a dreamlike quality. Just not necessarily when I fall asleep, but I do more of that dream practice in every day, because it just works better for me to bring the metaphor of dream to everyday life, because it helps me give a fluidity and movement to my interactions. Like I still see their body, but and their body may be moving or not, or say if they're sitting still, but there's a subtle movement coming from their body. Or you can say like like I've experienced on certain rainy days, and I go out and work. When stones are wet, when rock is wet, I sense a movement from that object. So it's this notion that for me that there's object, and then there's density of object, and then there's movement. So a lot of it. So dance works just as well as martial arts, because it's form and movement in different states of staticness, but whatever that is, there's also movement coming from those objects that I want to pay attention to, especially if I cross the street, if I go across the street, if that makes sense.
So we're coming up on the end of the hour. I guess we've just lost Lucy.
Yeah.
I'm looking for last thoughts, but also who wants to take the responsibility of doing next week's, which is a nice topic, this form, substance, and difference, which is based on the work of Korzybski, which is also, he's kind of an interesting guy as well.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do this one because I'm very interested in. I know some of Korzybski.
Yeah, I read his books, so yeah, so that would be great, Johnny. And then there's a couple more coming up that the others could think about maybe doing at some point.
I'll look at them and see which one I might take. I'll take on. I'll look at what's left. But now, do we have 3 or 4 weeks left?
I think we have 5, but I may be wrong.
From this week on, how many weeks?
4 weeks. I think you're
okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So we'll. So I'm looking forward to the next week, and it's quite it's a smaller text. There's not as much text to read, although this week was actually reasonable too. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Doug, did you have any final statement? I haven't heard from you in a while.
Quiet. I've been in listening mode. When I think about thought, and then with thought comes language, but then when I jump into the infinite possibilities, then I allow others to insert their thoughts. But I did have a thought when you kind of framed the closing segment of how do we, or what I extracted is how do we expand our circles at our best, perhaps. And then Geoffrey had his activity / project, which might be good for this group to kind of close out on or have in the back of our minds, like what have we extracted, and almost like the future of the body list out this long, or you listed out the list on one of the posts. Perhaps we could say, well,
I love
that change is this, but I also shied away or didn't like that idea. I felt we were already doing that, as we mentioned, with the going into the world type of idea. But Lucy is doing that with the undergraduates. Michael and I do that with our own children. And I see you, John, and Geoffrey as the experienced Bateson folk that are teaching me how to receive this text, which I would have likely had much more struggle, and I wouldn't have extracted certain elements if what has been brought forth by introductions or stories from the past or side thoughts and all that. So that's my last thought.
But although I love your introductions, so I always feel like, gee, I wish I could do something as clever as Doug.
Yeah, he does a good job at that. He does a good job.
Don't put me on the spot for future weeks. We'll see what happens. But, it's a good conversation. I appreciate it.
Yes, this has been good conversation. I appreciate it.
See you all next time then, next week.
Okay, be well, and don't forget to play. Play.
Serious play.
Play with the edges. Play with the edges.
Yes, play with the edges.